A broken bond. The first cracks in their marriage appeared as faint lines on a stained glass window, subtle, almost imperceptible, but growing with each passing day. Peter and Sue's home, a cozy cottage on the edge of a sleepy town, had always been a sanctuary. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the mornings, and the sound of their children's laughter echoed through the halls. Yet beneath the surface, something was shifting. Peter, a high school English teacher with a quiet intensity, had begun to arrive home late, his tie loosened, his eyes distant. He'd excuse himself to the kitchen where he'd stare at the coffee maker for minutes, as if waiting for some unspoken signal. Sue, a former graphic designer who now ran a small art studio, would set down her brush and glance at the clock, her jaw tightening. She'd say nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. Their children, Lily, 12, and Max, 9, sensed the tension but didn't understand its source. Lily, a thoughtful girl with a love for poetry, would retreat to her room, sketching in her notebook, her fingers tracing the words of letters to a young poet. Max, a fiery boy with a talent for soccer, would storm into the kitchen, demanding snacks, his frustration boiling over at the smallest provocation. The discord wasn't loud, but it was present. It seeped into their conversations, their routines, their unspoken expectations. Sue began to feel unseen, her own ambitions stifled by the weight of domesticity. Peter, meanwhile, felt trapped in a role he no longer recognized: husband, father, teacher. The cracks in their marriage were widening, but neither could name the cause. The affair began not with a dramatic gesture, but with a quiet complicity. Peter's colleague, Daniel, a charismatic history teacher with a reputation for being a bit too charming, had always been a familiar presence at the school's weekend potlucks. Their conversations, once lighthearted, grew more frequent. Daniel, recently divorced and struggling with the loneliness of single parenthood, began to confide in Peter about his own disillusionment. At first, their friendship was platonic, a shared love of literature, a mutual appreciation for good wine, and a tendency to linger over dinner. But over time, the conversations deepened. Daniel began to ask Peter about his life beyond the classroom, his frustrations with the school board, his longing for a connection that felt real. Peter, who had always felt invisible in his role, found himself drawn to Daniel's confidence. The first time they crossed a line was during a late-night walk home from a school event. The air was crisp, the streetlights casting long shadows. Daniel had mentioned his wife's recent departure, his voice tinged with bitterness. Peter, who had never spoken of his own marital struggles, found himself admitting how lonely he felt. The words hung between them, unspoken but understood. It wasn't love at first, but a desperate need for something more than what their marriage had become. Peter began to spend more time at Daniel's house, where the walls were lined with books and the silence was less oppressive. Daniel, in turn, began to spend more time at Peter's home, where the children's laughter was a constant reminder of a life he'd abandoned. The discovery came in the form of a text message found on Peter's phone by Sue. The message was brief. "I'm sorry, Sue. It's not what you think." She read it twice, her hands trembling. The words felt like a punch to the gut, but the real blow was the silence that followed. Sue did confront Peter immediately. Instead, she wandered into the kitchen, where Lily was poring over a sketchbook. "Lily," she said, her voice steady but strained, "can we talk?" The girl looked up, her eyes wide with confusion. Sue didn't explain. She simply said, "Your father is seeing someone." Lily's face paled. Is this true?" Sue hesitated, then nodded. The room seemed to shrink around them. Lily's fingers curled into her skirt, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought we were okay." Later that night, Sue found Peter in the garage, his back to her, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "You knew," she said, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. "I've been trying to make this work," she continued. "I've been trying to be the wife you needed, but you didn't even notice me." Peter's shoulders sagged. "I didn't mean to hurt you. Did you think it would be okay?" The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words. In the days that followed, Peter and Sue tried to salvage their marriage. They began couples therapy, a decision neither made lightly. The sessions were awkward, filled with unspoken resentments and half-truths. Sue asked Peter why he'd chosen Daniel over her. Peter, in turn, asked Sue why she hadn't reached out to him. Their attempts to communicate were met with resistance. Sue, feeling betrayed into her art, painting scenes of fractured mirrors and empty rooms. Peter, overwhelmed by guilt, buried himself in work, neglecting his children. Lily, feeling responsible for the rift, began to isolate herself, her sketches growing darker, more abstract. Max, meanwhile, lashed out, accusing his parents of being liars and unlovable. The children's pain was a quiet storm, unspoken but palpable. Daniel, who had initially offered to help mend the relationship, grew distant. He couldn't bear to see Peter so broken, nor could he face the reality of his own complicity. "I didn't mean to destroy anything," he told Sue one evening, his voice low. I needed someone." The marriage, once a fragile thing, now seemed to crumble entirely. The divorce process was as messy as the relationship itself. Legal battles over custody, financial settlements, and the emotional toll on the children left everyone exhausted. Lily, now 13, began skipping school, her grades slipping as she struggled to reconcile her parents' divorce with her own sense of identity. Max, now 10, threw tantrums in public, his anger a reflection of the chaos around him. Sue, once a vibrant artist, found herself painting in silence, her canvases filled with scenes of broken glass and shadowed figures. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd failed her family. Peter, meanwhile, moved into a small apartment, his life reduced to a routine of teaching and late-night walks. He tried to reconnect with his children, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. Daniel, too, found himself adrift. He tried to rebuild his life, but the guilt of his actions lingered. He sent a brief message to Sue, apologizing but never followed up. Time, as it often does, began to heal. Sue, after months of silence, started attending art classes, her work gaining attention in local galleries. She began to see her children not as the product of a broken marriage, but as individuals with their own stories. Lily, inspired by her mother's art, started writing poetry, her words a way to process her grief. Max, though still angry, found solace in soccer, his teammates becoming a new family of sorts. Peter, too, began to rebuild. He took a job at a community center, tutoring students in need. He started attending support groups for divorced fathers, where he met others struggling to navigate the aftermath of their own marriages. He began to see his children not as a burden, but as a reminder of the life he'd once had. The children, though still, found ways to move forward. Lily, now 14, began to understand that love isn't always perfect, but it can still be real. Max, now 11, learned to channel his anger into art, creating murals that told the story of his family's journey. In the end, the mirror was broken, but not irreparably. Each piece reflected a different truth: Sue's resilience, Peter's regret, Lily's hope, Max's resilience. The fractures were visible, but they also allowed light to pass through, illuminating paths that hadn't been possible before. Sue and Peter, though no longer married, found a strange kind of peace. They saw each other at school events, their children's laughter a reminder of the life they'd once shared. They didn't reconcile, but they didn't need to. The mirror, once shattered, had become a mosaic, each piece a story, each shard a lesson. And in the quiet moments, they both realized that healing wasn't about restoring what was lost, but about finding new ways to live.